Dust motes danced in the slanted beam of sunlight that pierced the grime-coated windowpane. Abigail Harrow stared at them, their frenetic waltz a stark contrast to the stillness that choked the air in the cavernous library. The scent of mildew and decay hung heavy, clinging to the leather-bound volumes lining the oak shelves like faded memories. Outside, a relentless gale howled across the desolate plains, whipping at the aged facade of Sherwood Manor. The groans and creaks of the house seemed to echo the disquiet gnawing at Abigail's soul. Trapped, she thought, not for the first time. Trapped in this decaying monument to the Harrow family's fading glory, trapped in Harrow Creek, a forgotten town at the arse end of nowhere. A guttural cough shattered the silence. Abigail flinched, turning to see her father emerge from the shadows. Gideon Harrow, a man sculpted by years of hardship and shrouded in a perpetual cloud of disapproval, loomed even larger in the dim light. "Abigail!" His voice rasped, a sandpaper grind against the silence. "Don't you have farm duties to attend to?" Abigail straightened, the defiance in her eyes a stark contrast to his stoicism. "There's barely enough left to tend to, father. The drought." Gideon cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Excuses, girl. Excuses won't fill an empty belly." His gaze flicked around the room, landing on a book lying open on the worn table. "Been reading that heretical trash again, haven't you?" The book was a collection of poetry, a world away from the religious tracts Gideon favored. "Just escaping for a bit, father," Abigail replied, her voice a low growl. "There's nothing else to do here." Gideon's lips thinned into a disapproving line. "Escape won't save you, girl. Not from what's coming." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The whispers are getting louder, Abigail. They speak of reckoning. Be prepared." Before Abigail could question him further, Gideon turned and shuffled out of the room, leaving her alone with the echoes of his cryptic words and a growing sense of foreboding. Reckoning? What reckoning? The Harrows had already been dealt their share of hardship. What more could be coming? The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within her. A knot of anger twisted in her gut, hot and acidic. Resentment burned at the injustice of it all. Generations had toiled on this unforgiving land, their sweat and blood poured into the soil, only to be met with relentless drought. And yet, here she was, the supposed beneficiary of a dark bargain, trapped in this decaying monument to a family's fading glory. The weight of the Harrow name felt heavy on her shoulders. Was this all there was? To be forever bound to a bargain made by a desperate ancestor, a pact that reeked of desperation and a hunger for power that had poisoned the very ground they walked on. A flicker of rebellion sparked within her. No. She wouldn't be a pawn in this twisted game. She would unravel the secrets of the agreement, break free from its shackles, and forge her own destiny, even if it meant defying the very fabric of her family's history. A horse and rider approached Sherwood Manor with an unsettling purpose. Abigail, standing at the window, felt her heart race as she recognized the unmistakable silhouette of Reverend Silas Blight. His arrival had stirred the stagnant air of Harrow Creek, bringing with him a disturbing energy that seemed to coil around the very foundations of the town. Her curiosity piqued, she watched as the horse and rider grew closer, the clergyman's black attire stark against the amber hues of the setting sun. His eyes, even from a distance, seemed to bore into her very soul, a disquieting reminder of the unspoken fascination he had for her. Abigail's hand tightened around the journal she had found, the pages whispering of ancient contract and unspeakable sacrifices. Her thoughts were interrupted by the clatter of hooves and the crunch of gravel as the Reverend dismounted and made his way to the front door. She hurriedly shoved the journal into the folds of her skirt, her heart thudding against her ribs. The anticipation of his visit was palpable, thickening the air in the mansion like the humidity before a downpour. The door creaked open, and the Reverend's silhouette filled the doorway. "Miss Harrow," he called out, his voice smooth as velvet and just as suffocating. "Your father has allowed me to borrow some of your time." Abigail took a deep breath, steeling herself for the encounter. As she descended the grand staircase, the murmurs grew louder, their echoes a sinister counterpoint to the thud of her boots on the worn carpet. Gideon waited in the foyer, his face a mask of stoic resignation. "Your guess," he grunted, gesturing towards the drawing room before retreating into the shadows. The Reverend's smile was a flash of white in the dim light as he stepped aside to allow her to enter. The room was suffused with the scent of his cologne, an unwelcome intrusion in the stale air of the mansion. "Abigail," he began, his eyes raking over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Your father tells me you've been feeling unsettled. Perhaps we can discuss it?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, a veiled invitation to reveal her deepest fears and secrets. She met his gaze, her own eyes narrowing. "I'm fine, Reverend," she lied, her voice steady. "But I'm intrigued by your sudden interest in our family's well-being." Blight's smile never wavered. "Ah, the curiosity of youth," he said, his tone patronizing. "I merely wish to offer guidance in these troubled times." Abigail felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end as she took a seat opposite him. The hisses grew louder, their intensity making her head spin. What did this man know? What did he want from her? "Your ancestor," he began, his eyes gleaming, "was a very wise man. He understood the true price of prosperity." Her hand clenched around the journal, hidden in her skirt pocket. The sighs grew to a crescendo, and the room seemed to tilt on its axis. "What do you know about the covenant?" she demanded, the words tearing from her throat. Blight's smile grew wider, his eyes alight with something that was not quite human. "More than you could ever imagine, Miss Harrow," he said, leaning in closer. "And I've come to collect." Abigail's heart pounded as she clutched the journal tightly. The hisses grew into a roar, drowning out the sound of the ticking clock on the mantel. It was as if the very walls of the mansion were alive with the anguished cries of her ancestors, begging her to stop this madness before it was too late. Her mind raced with thoughts of the pact she had discovered, the horrific ritual that had been performed to ensure the Harrows' prosperity. The journal spoke of an entity, a thing of shadow and malice, that had been bound to the family's lineage. A being that demanded a price with each new generation. "The whispers," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are they?" The Reverend leaned back in his chair, his smile turning predatory. "They are the echoes of the past, Abigail, the souls of those who have suffered for your family's greed." Panic gripped her. "What do you want from me?" Blight's eyes glittered. "Only what is owed. Your family's debt has come due." The tension in the room grew thick, the air crackling with an electric anticipation that made her skin crawl. Abigail knew she had to act, to find a way to break the curse before it consumed her as it had her ancestors. But how could she fight a legend and a man who seemed to wield dark powers? The fireplace crackled, casting flickering darkness across the Reverend's face, making him seem more monstrous than ever. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, holding it up for her to see. A silver key, tarnished with age. "This will unlock the chamber beneath the mansion," he said, his voice a purr, "where the final sacrifice was made. It's time for you to pay your respects." With trembling hands, Abigail took the key. The rasps grew so loud she could almost make out words, pleas for mercy and cries of despair. Her father's footsteps could be heard in the hallway, his cough a warning of his approach. "Thank you, Reverend," she managed, her voice a brittle facade. I'll consider your words." As the Reverend left, the whispers faded, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence of the drawing room. Her mind raced with the implications of his visit. The pact, the creature, the whispers, it was all real. And now, it was her turn to face the consequences. With a heavy heart, she made her way to the chamber, the silver key cold and heavy in her hand. The candlelight flickered as she descended the stairs, illuminating the cobwebs and dust that had gathered in the corners. The air grew colder, the scent of ancient decay stronger with each step. At the bottom, she found the door, its wooden panels scarred with what looked like claw marks. The key turned in the lock with a sickening click, and the door swung open to reveal a space that had not seen the light of day in decades. In the center of the room stood an altar, stained with what she dared not think about. Around it, shadows danced in the candlelight, hinting at the presence of the monster that had haunted her dreams since she first read the journal. The rasps grew to a fever pitch, and she knew she had to act. With a deep breath, she stepped into the chamber, ready to confront her family's legacy of darkness. The storm outside seemed to mirror her own internal turmoil, the thunder a drumbeat to her racing pulse. As she approached the altar, the shadows grew restless, coalescing into a form that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Its eyes, burning with an unearthly light, met hers, and she knew she had no choice but to face it head-on. Abigail raised the journal, her voice a mix of fear and determination as she recited the incantation she had found within its pages. The beast howled, its form writhing and contorting as the words of ancient power took hold. The ground beneath her trembled, and she felt the very fabric of the mansion groan in protest. As the incantation reached its crescendo, the creature lunged, its shifting tendril limbs reaching for her, but she was ready. With a flick of her wrist, she threw a handful of salt into the air. The crystalline granules caught the candlelight, shimmering like stars before they rained down onto the entity. It recoiled, shrieking, as the purity of the salt burned through the darkness. Abigail took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. The creature's form grew weaker, the shadowy pronouncements retreating like a tide receding from the shore. In that moment, she knew she had the upper hand. "You will not claim me," she declared, her voice echoing through the chamber. "I reject this bond." It writhed and twisted, its howls of rage reverberating through the very stones of the mansion. The room grew brighter, the candle flames leaping to meet the shadows, and the air grew hot with the scent of brimstone. The journal in her hand began to burn, the ancient parchment smoldering into ash. But it did not vanish. Instead, it grew larger, its eyes boring into her very soul. "The pact," it hissed, its voice a chorus of the damned, "cannot be broken by one so weak." Her resolve wavered, but she steeled herself, gripping the silver key tightly. "I am not weak," she spat. "I am Abigail Harrow, and this ends with me." A flicker of surprise crossed the creature's looming figure. "You misunderstand, child," it rasped, its voice a chilling counterpoint to Abigail's defiance. "I am not driven by mere hunger. I crave balance, an equilibrium between prosperity and decay. The arrangement ensured that Harrow Creek would flourish, but at a cost. The life force I consume fuels the land's fertility." Abigail's mind reeled. It wasn't a mindless monster, but a twisted reflection of nature's cycle. "So you're a twisted harvest god?" she scoffed. The creature's form contorted in a mockery of a smile. "A god? No, child. Merely a force, a necessary evil your ancestor bound himself to in a desperate bid to save his people. The land was barren, crops withered, and despair choked the very air. He offered me a life force in exchange for the town's revival." Abigail's anger simmered. "A life force? You mean a soul? Every generation, you claimed a Harrow firstborn." The entity's voice grew quieter, tinged with a hint of regret. "The price, yes. But a small one compared to the suffering that would have consumed Harrow Creek. Your ancestor gambled, hoping future generations would find a way to break the compact or appease me with a different offering." Abigail stared at the creature, its words echoing in the chamber. The contract wasn't born out of malice, but a desperate act of survival. Yet, it had twisted into a horrifying tradition that had claimed countless lives, including her own if she hadn't intervened. With a scream of fury, she slammed the key into the heart of the creature's figure. But a flicker of doubt, cold and unwelcome, snaked through her resolve. What if its words were true? Was she condemning Harrow Creek to a return of the drought and despair her ancestor had sought to escape? The image of her townsfolk, their faces etched with hunger and desperation, flashed through her mind. For a fleeting moment she faltered, the key trembling in her hand. Steeling herself, she plunged the key home. The monster shrieked, a sound that tore at her very being, and a wave of nausea washed over her. But she held firm, the weight of generations resting on her shoulders. This had to end. The room was bathed in a blinding flash of light, and its howl became a wail of despair that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. When the light faded, the fiend was gone, leaving only the acrid scent of burnt oak and a cold, empty space where it had once been. Breathing heavily, Abigail stumbled out of the chamber, the whispers now a distant echo. The storm outside had reached its peak, the wind and rain lashing against the mansion like the entity's final, futile attempts to claim her. She knew that the battle was not over, that the arrangement had merely been temporarily banished, but for now, she had bought herself some time. Her father's cough grew louder as she ascended the stairs, and she knew she had to tell him the truth. The weight of the family secret had been lifted from her, but she could not bear the thought of Gideon's suffering any longer. As she reached the top, the mansion's doors banged open, the storm's fury invading their sanctuary. "Father!" she called out, the word torn from her by the gust. Gideon stumbled into the hallway, his eyes wild with terror. "Abigail!" he choked out. "You've done it! You've set it free!" The realization hit her like a physical blow. It had not been banished, it had been released. The eerie emanations had been a warning, not a plea for help. In her quest for freedom, she had unleashed a monster upon her family, and the town she had sworn to protect. The wind grew stronger, the house groaning around them as the being's rage grew. "We must leave!" Gideon shouted over the din. "Now!" Abigail nodded, her mind racing. They could not outrun this darkness, not without facing it head-on. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We will end this here." Together, father and daughter made their way back to the drawing room, the winds raging around them. Its presence now a palpable force in the air. It was waiting for them, she knew, eager to claim the life she had denied it. But she was ready. With a deep breath, she turned to Gideon. "Tell me everything you know," she demanded. "We must find a way to end this pact, once and for all." Gideon's face was a map of pain and regret, but he nodded. "The pact," he began, his voice barely audible over the racket, "was made by your great-great-grandfather. He sought to save the town, to save us all from the drought and despair that had ravaged Harrow Creek. He offered the demon a soul in exchange for prosperity, never thinking it would come to this." Abigail felt a cold hand clutch at her heart. "Whose soul?" Gideon's eyes met hers, filled with a sorrow that spoke volumes. "The firstborn of each generation." The implication was clear. She was the latest in a line of sacrifices, born to appease a monster she had unwittingly released. "We can't just run," she said, her voice tight. "We have to find a way to banish it." Her father handed her an aged map, its edges brittle and yellowed. "This," he said, his voice trembling, "shows where it was originally bound. We must return it to that place." The map was a tapestry of cryptic symbols and twisting lines, but one spot stood out, a dark stain in the corner that matched the description of the creature's prison. It lay deep within the desolate forest that surrounded the town, a place whispered about in fear and avoided by all. The gale grew more frenzied, the house groaning under its relentless assault. The unearthly murmurs grew louder, closer, until it was as if the walls themselves were speaking to her, urging her to flee. But she knew she couldn't. The thing was coming for her, and she had to be ready. With a deep breath, Abigail took up a candlestick, its flame flickering in the wind. "We'll need salt," she said, her voice firm. "And holy water. Anything that can weaken it." Gideon nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I have some in the study," he said, already moving towards the door. "But we must be quick." The wind howled, and its darkness loomed closer. Abigail could feel its malevolence, a tangible force that sent shivers down her spine. They gathered what they could, their movements frantic and desperate. The mansion was alive with a shadowy presence, the air thick with the scent of its fury. Reaching the entrance, the fragmented messages coalesced, forming a chilling chorus. The monster was upon them, stretching through the hallway like a living nightmare. Abigail took a deep breath, her hand tightening around the candlestick. "We'll do this together," she said to her father. They stepped into the downpour, the rain lashing at their faces, the creature's forms snaking through the cracks in the door. They mounted their horses, the animals trembling with fear, and rode into the night, the path ahead as dark and uncertain as their fate. The town of Harrow Creek lay in silence, the storm's fury a backdrop to their grim errand. The only sound was the pounding of hooves on the dirt road and the distant toll of the church bell, its peals a mournful chant that seemed to follow them like a funeral procession. The forest loomed ahead, a black maw that promised no refuge. The murmurs grew fainter as they approached, replaced by the howling of the wind and the creaking of ancient trees. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of her family's legacy pressing down on her like a leaden shroud. They reached the spot marked on the map, a clearing shrouded in darkness. The rain had turned to a fine mist, hanging in the air like a shroud. The ground was wet and spongy beneath their feet, and she could feel the malevolence of the creature's prison seeping through her boots. With trembling hands, she began to read the incantation she had found in the journal. The words were foreign, ancient, but they resonated within her, a power she had never felt before. The air grew colder, the mist thickening until it was almost solid. The silhouette grew larger, its hissing now a deafening roar. Gideon held out the vial of holy water, his hand shaking. "Now, Abigail!" he shouted over the noise. "Now!" With a cry that was part fear and part determination, she hurled the candlestick into the clearing. The silver impaled the dark heart of the shadow, and the prison cracked open like a lightning-struck tree. The rain ceased, and the clearing was bathed in an eerie calm. Abigail stepped forward, the incantation still echoing in her mind. She felt the power of the words coil around her, filling her with a strength she hadn't known she had. It emerged from the shadows, its form a twisted mockery of humanity, its eyes burning with a hunger that could never be sated. "I am Abigail Harrow," she shouted, her voice carried through the forest. "I reject your pact. I free the souls you have claimed." The being lunged, its claws reaching for her, but she was ready. She splashed the holy water onto its shadowy form, and it recoiled, screeching in agony. The shadows retreated. Together, she and Gideon recited the incantation, their voices a united front against the ancient evil. The creature writhed and shrank before them, the ground beneath it cracking and crumbling. As the last of the whispers faded into silence, its form dissipated into the mist, leaving only the silver key, now cold and lifeless, embedded in the earth. The tempest had passed, leaving the forest bathed in moonlight. The two stood, panting and exhausted, staring into the abyss where the creature had been. "Is it over?" Abigail asked, her voice small in the vastness of the night. Gideon nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and regret. "For now," he said. "But the transaction cannot be undone. Our ancestors' bargain will always lurk in the shadows of Harrow Creek." They mounted their horses, the journey back to the mansion feeling longer and more solemn than the ride out. The town lay still, the only sound the distant hoot of an owl. As they approached the house, the windows glowed with candlelight, a beacon of hope in the darkness. In the drawing room, the sighs had stilled, the air no longer thick with malice. Abigail collapsed into a chair, her heart still racing. Gideon took a seat opposite her, his eyes haunted. "We must leave," he said, his voice heavy. "We can never truly escape what we've done, but we can start anew, far from this cursed place." Abigail nodded, her thoughts racing. Could they ever outrun the specter of the promise? Would the creature return, seeking vengeance for its temporary defeat? But for now, she was weary, her body aching from the battle. "Rest," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We'll leave at dawn." The night passed in a blur of half-sleep and haunting dreams. When the first light of day crept over the horizon, they were ready. They packed what little they had, their eyes lingering on the mansion that had been both their prison and their fortress. The storm had spent its fury, leaving behind a chilling silence that mirrored the emptiness within Abigail. It was gone, banished back to the abyss from whence it came. Yet, a hollowness echoed in her chest, a void where the whispers of the past once resided. Abigail nodded, her throat tight. The air hung heavy with a cloying sweetness, the scent of honeysuckle battling the ever-present tang of decay. She thought of the library, its shelves stacked with moldering tomes, a monument to a forgotten past. Of the dusty portraits lining the grand staircase, their subjects staring down with eyes that held the secrets of generations. The grand hall, once a place of merriment, now echoed with emptiness. A lone cobweb, shimmering with the remnants of a spider's feast, hung from the cracked chandelier. Gideon paused before the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the cold, lifeless ashes. "This house," he murmured. "It was built on a bargain, Abigail. A prosperity balanced on a knife's edge." Abigail walked to the window, her gaze sweeping over the desolate plains. The once fertile fields lay barren, cracked earth stretching towards the horizon like a skeletal hand reaching for something it could never grasp. The wind, ever present, whispered a mournful song through the dry stalks of corn, a constant reminder of the price they had paid. Turning away, she met her father's gaze. "We leave at noon," she declared, her voice stronger than she felt. "We'll take only what we can carry, memories and lessons learned the hard way." Gideon nodded, a flicker of pride momentarily chasing away the weariness in his eyes. They packed a meager bag, filled with the remnants of a life lived under a dark cloud. As they stepped out onto the porch, the midday sun beat down mercilessly, casting their shadows long and stark against the cracked facade of the house. With one final glance at the decaying monument of their past, Abigail turned and walked away, her head held high. Behind them, Sherwood Manor stood silent, a stark sentinel against the desolate landscape. The wind howled, a mournful dirge for a family's legacy and a town forever marked by the darkness they had unleashed. Towards the horizon, two figures dwarfed by the vastness of the sky. The road ahead stretched out before them, an uncertain path leading them away from the ghosts of the past. The haunting reminders of Harrow Creek lay behind them, a stark reminder of the burden they carried, a burden that would forever bind them to the land and the deal they had broken. But as they walked, a crow circled overhead, its harsh caw echoing in the stillness. It seemed to follow them, a dark omen against the bruised canvas of the sky. A single feather, black as night, drifted down and landed at Abigail's feet. She picked it up, the smooth surface cool against her palm. A shiver ran down her spine, a sudden disquiet settling in her gut. The crow continued its circling dance, its shrill cry a constant reminder. Did the pact truly lie broken, or had they merely disturbed the entity's slumber? The creature's words about the cycle of nature, about a balance needing to be maintained, echoed in Abigail's mind. Perhaps they had not banished the darkness, but merely shifted its form. They walked on, the weight of the unknown heavy on their shoulders. The crow's shadow fell upon them, a chilling reminder that the consequences of their actions were far from over. The road stretched endlessly before them, leading not just away from Harrow Creek, but towards an uncertain future, a future where the whispers of the past might yet return, a chilling melody carried on the wind. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider subscribing to stay updated with our latest stories, give us a like if you want to see more, and drop a comment below to let us know your thoughts.